This is No Talking in the Library, a media podcast produced by Mentor Public Library, where we'll be talking about movies, comics, TV shows, basically anything we think is interesting.
This is No Talking in the Library. I'm Meredith.
And I'm John.
And we're coming at you from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, recording from the... Nope, almost said Pequod. That would have been a librarian fail. But who cares, because today's topic is favorite movies. So I'm going to just kick it right off to you, John. What is your favorite movie? And assume the why part of that is implied.
Okay, my favorite movie... Well, we talked about when we were putting this episode together what it is exactly that you mean by your favorite movie when somebody asks you. And maybe I can get to that a little by discussing what I think is my favorite movie, which is Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now was filmed in the Philippines between 1976 and 1978. It was released in the spring of 1979. It was nominated for an Academy Award, but it didn't win. I think one reason was that that was the year that Kramer vs. Kramer, an even more depressing movie, won most of the Academy Awards. Apocalypse Now is a story, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's based on Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and it's about a U.S. Army Special Forces soldier who's sent up a river into Cambodia to execute another U.S. Army Special Forces soldier who's kind of gone rogue, and it's about his journey up there and all the things that he sees and all the things that he does. And I saw this movie for the first time when I was about 12, and it just really took my breath away. I've seen it probably 24 times since then, which is a real project because it's really long. I mean, you've watched it. It's very, very long and very involved. And the thing I find really compelling about it is that unlike a lot of Vietnam movies, the war is kind of a backdrop for it, but it's really a sort of examination of the human condition. And I kind of like movies that try to tell us something about who we are or what our motivations and things are. And a lot of this movie is Captain Willard, the main character, who's on this journey on a PT boat, on a river combat boat up into Cambodia, sort of trying to figure out who Colonel Kurtz, this person he's supposed to kill, is. And it has this very compelling narration. A lot of times I don't really like narration in movies because I like to sort of let the movie tell me what's going on. But this narration was written by Michael Herr, who was a famous journalist in Vietnam in 1967, 1968, 69 for Esquire magazine. He wrote a very famous book called Dispatches, which I really recommend to anybody who hears this. But he wrote this incredible narration, which is delivered by Martin Sheen. And there are parts in it that just absolutely make the hair rise on the back of my neck. There's a moment where he and one of the main characters go into the jungle and they nearly get killed by a tiger, and he turns this into a kind of meditation on how you sort of relate to the norms in the world. He says, never get off the boat unless you're going all the way. And that I always find really compelling, because you either have to stick with the normal world that you're in, or if you're going to deviate from that, you might as well just go all the way down the road, because you can't, if you kind of go halfway, then you're not going to, then you'll be wiped out or whatever. So I think the reason that this movie is my favorite movie is that it talks to a lot of sort of interesting things in American history, but it moves kind of above that and tries to tell us something about who we are as people, and that I think is the thing that I find most compelling.
I had not seen this movie before until preparing for this, and it is long. It is like 3 hours of increasingly, I want to almost say absurdist encounters. I think that was really the most surprising part for me, was as they're going up the river, they keep running into these strange things, like in the middle of the jungle, like parties and whatnot.
Right. There's that moment where they get to the bridge where really anarchy reigns, and they keep trying to find the CO. They keep trying to find some sense of order, and there's that moment right at the end of it where the guy with the grenade launcher has sort of done his thing, and Martin Sheen says to him, "Do you know who's in command here?" And he says, "Yeah," and just walks off. And that is a perfect expression of the kind of absurdist, I think is the best word for it, kind of anarchy that was reigning. And it gets to kind of the point that Conrad was trying to make in The Heart of Darkness, which is that we have these sort of normal ways that we live, but if you dig down underneath it, there's something kind of ugly and frightening that we don't want to look at, and that our sort of society keeps you from having to look at all the time. And that's the thing that Apocalypse Now really wants to make you look at sort of through the lens of the Vietnam War.
I do have to say, though, I find the last 40 minutes almost impenetrable when Marlon Brando is sort of rambling nonsensically, and at that point I really had no idea what was going on, and I felt like I shouldn't be surprised a director like Francis Ford Coppola, who is very much an auteur, is influenced by people like Ingmar Bergman. I felt like at that point Marlon Brando was about to switch places with Liv Ullmann or P.B. Anderson or something. It got very Persona-like there at the end. It made it very weird. It didn't seem to mesh with what I thought was happening in the first 2 hours of it.
Right, it gets very different. And if you watch Hearts of Darkness, which is the documentary that they made about the making of the movie, what you find is that they had this very hard time with Marlon Brando. He came in, it was unclear whether he was going to show up or not, whether he was going to fulfill his contract. And then he came in and he was really overweight and he didn't really understand the story very well. And so they just sort of filmed him talking, and eventually Coppola kind of cut together some stuff that made sense. But sometimes he had these real moments of lucidity. So there's that exchange between Kurtz and Willard when Kurtz says to him, "Are you an assassin?" And Willard says, "I'm a soldier." And Kurtz says, "You're neither. You're an errand boy sent by grocery clerks to collect a bill." And that is a sort of fundamental statement of what the movie is about. You have these people who just think the war is a kind of exchange of goods, or it's a kind of normal thing that you could just work into the way human life goes, and it's not. And this is what Kurtz wants to tell us, that this is why it's called Apocalypse Now. Like, this is, in a way, the kind of end of the world that you're sort of seeing play out with American flags everywhere. And it's a very jarring thing. But I also understand that, especially after 2.5 hours of movie to get there, it's a very taxing thing to then have to try and push through. Also, when we were doing this, we kind of came out with our lists of what our favorite movies were. And I want to say before I turn over to you to talk about what your favorite movies are, I was a little surprised because so many of the movies that you picked are, I don't want to say happy, but I mean there's a very upbeat theme to a lot, at least, of what you picked here. So what do you think is your favorite movie on this list that you've come up with?
I think the question of what I would tell a person is my favorite movie is not necessarily the movie I've seen the most times, because I think when someone's asking you, hey, what's your favorite movie, they're not really asking you, what is the movie you've watched the most? They're trying to get a sense of who you are. So if you give an answer like Legally Blonde, I'm going to judge you, because we're talking like desert island movie, favorite movie, the movie that had the most impact on you, like not the movie you put in when you are feeling sick or looking to kill some time. So for me, I normally would say Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, but actually I'm thinking more now it would probably be Amélie, because I think that Amélie has aged a little bit better than Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
I think that's true in a lot of respects, and I will say that sort of during the prep for this, I think I may have seen Amélie close to the time that it came out, but this was the first time I'd watched it sort of thinking about it, and it's a really remarkable film in a lot of ways.
Amélie is a French film directed by Jean-Pierre Jeunet from 2001, and it's the story of a young woman who is very lonely. She's isolated from her peers and her family, and she has her sort of day-to-day pleasures and indulgences. She likes to take photos. She likes to slip her hand in a basket of legumes or something at the market. She likes to skip stones. And I think the reason that I like this movie, as opposed to saying my favorite movie is Apocalypse Now, because when I watch something like Apocalypse Now, I sit there wondering, what is in this movie for me? I recognize that Apocalypse Now is an incredibly well-made movie. It's like so much time and effort went into making it, but there's nothing in it for me watching it. It's just a bunch of guys running around the jungle, which I get. But Amélie, I identify and relate so much to the main character played by Audrey Tautou in the way that she moves around the world, sort of not in it, but more of an observer. And I'm sure you've seen this while watching it yourself. So one of the most brilliant aspects of Amélie is the film's really dramatic red, green, yellow color scheme. And I believe the director was influenced by a Brazilian painter. But what happens is that these digitally enhanced colors end up highlighting the artificiality of the movie. And I know that sounds bad. You don't necessarily want to be reminded you're watching a film. But when it's coupled with the plot of the movie, which is that Amélie is this perpetual daydreamer out to do these random acts of kindness, it ends up giving you the sensation that you're in someone's very carefully constructed imagination, and it really gives the film a timeless feel.
I will just say that one of the things that really struck me, I know we're both fans of the TV shows that Brian Fuller has made, Pushing Daisies and Dead Like Me and Wonder Falls, which I hadn't really watched until you directed my attention to it. But I watched this movie and I really thought that Jean-Pierre Jeunet was kind of like a French version of Brian Fuller, in the sense that he had this sort of whimsical thing going on, and he had characters who don't seem to quite fit in the world. He has this sort of sense of the bizarre. There's the whole thing where the mother is killed by the person jumping off Notre Dame Cathedral, and there's things talking in it that don't normally talk.
That's why I like it, and it wasn't until you pointed out the Brian Fuller connection that I think I really realized what it is I like about it. And like Brian Fuller, Amélie has a sense of whimsy, exactly what you said, but the whimsy is very much tempered by an interest in death, which gives the movie a little more weight, I think, to it, because there are these sort of magical realist things happening. Amélie talks to photographs, and at various points her lamps talk to a painting, so very odd things, but then there's also that sadness that runs sort of below the film. Her father is a lonely man. She doesn't really have friends. Oh, that's the other thing I really like about it. She's vengeful. She has no problem getting a petty revenge on people she thinks who have wronged her, or the people that she appreciates, or the people that she is acquainted with. And I think that is hilarious.
Yeah, that was another, I think, very Turner-esque dimension of this movie. And it also struck me that maybe you like this movie for a reason that's similar to the reason that I like Apocalypse Now. And also that the reason why you don't like Apocalypse Now is a sort of mirror image for this, which is that it's fairly clear to me that this is a character that you see a bit of yourself in. Maybe that's something that explains why we like the movies that we do. I don't see myself as a commando heading up some river in Cambodia, but the thing that's interesting about what Willard is doing for a lot of the movie in Apocalypse Now is he's trying to figure out who Kurtz is and why he's so far outside the norm, why this guy who was the perfect candidate for, he says at one point they were grooming him for the top job in the company, and then he's become this very marginal figure. And this is what I'm sort of trying to do with every human being that I meet, is figure out what their story is and what sort of historically has made them into the person that they are. And I think there's a kind of similar thing that goes on with Amélie. For you, it struck me that maybe this is a person who you don't quite want to wreak vengeance, or maybe you do, but who you could sort of see her motivations, and her motivations seemed familiar and sort of homely to you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I can very much identify with the motivations and the way that Amélie operates and the way that she navigates the world is very much in line with the way I do. Apocalypse Now is a miserable 2.5 hour plus slog, so you probably don't just sit down every afternoon when you're thinking, what do I want to watch? Let's put in Apocalypse Now. So what is a movie that you've probably seen the most times?
I think probably the movie that I've seen the most times, at least if I'm going by recently, and if I was just sort of sitting around and wanted to watch a movie, the movie that I find the most compelling is Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which is a fairly recent movie. It was done in 2014. It's in that Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think it's far and away the best one.
Oh, that's no competition. The Winter Soldier is the best MCU film they've made so far.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's so much because a lot of what it does is investigate Captain America, Steve Rogers, and how he views himself in the world and what he views his role. And this gets played out in a lot of the other MCU movies. It gets played out a lot in Civil War, the sequel movie to that. But a lot of this movie is Steve Rogers discovering that S.H.I.E.L.D. has this plan to set up a sort of global security system that will take out people who are going to do bad things sort of algorithmically before they can do them. And Steve Rogers has this sort of older school idea of what freedom is about. And freedom for him is not just the freedom to do good things, it's the freedom to err. And if you're going to go through the world and just sort of weed out all these people, he says at one point to Nick Fury,
yeah, we compromised, sometimes in ways that made us not sleep so well. But we did it so that people could be free. This isn't freedom. This is fear.
You know, and that I find very compelling. But also he has this sort of long character development segment in the movie with Black Widow, the character played by
Scarlett Johansson,
who is a sort of, she's come up in the Marvel comic books as a really heartless assassin who then sort of flips around, like if you see her development in the Daredevil comics, or in her own comics that were done by Phil Noto, and he did the art, and I think Nathanson was the story writer. She sort of has a revelation that she wants to be a good person. You see this in the first Avengers movie where she goes to Loki. There's that scene with her and Loki where she sort of makes it seem like she's feeling contrite about these things, and she wants to sort of right the balance by getting Loki to spare Hawkeye, and she just plays him. She's such a perfect spy that she can do whatever she wants. But she spends a lot of this movie sort of in conversation with Steve Rogers, where they kind of learn to trust each other, and they are both in a sort of process of figuring out what it means to be a superhero. And this I find sort of the most compelling thing in a way, because I could see myself as Steve Rogers. Okay, it's easy that there's, I look at Steve Rogers and I can sort of see a version of myself. That makes a certain amount of sense. But I think it's really interesting to think about superheroes in that way and to try and think, well, what would I do if I was in that situation? And would I have the guts to kind of step outside what I'm supposed to do and do what I really think is right?
Yeah, The Winter Soldier is great because I think it's one of the few MCU films that can really stand on its own. It's not weighted down by an Infinity Stone MacGuffin hunt or anything. And it's basically a Captain America, Black Widow movie. She's not named in the title, but she's a huge player in the film.
Yeah, I think their relationship is really interesting, and particularly because they're so different. Steve Rogers is this war hero who's come back, and he's Captain America. That the moniker says it all. Whereas she's a sort of Red Room trained life taker. I mean, she's just the sort of ultimate coffin salesman. And you would think that it would be hard for them to find a way to relate to each other. But they do, and they find a way to trust each other. And I think that that's a really interesting sort of character development that you don't get in a lot of the other MCU movies, especially because in the Avengers movies there's so many characters that there isn't really time to figure out very much what the characters are really about. And I think that really sets this movie apart. So if you were going to go home right now and just kick around for a few hours, what would be the movie that you would put on?
The movie that I've seen the most, and this is probably really embarrassing, but it's probably gotta be Clueless. 1995 film directed and written by Amy Heckerling, female director. You don't see that, as much as you probably should. And I'm not entirely sure why I like the movie so much, but it just never fails to make me laugh. And I think for me, when it comes to watching a movie over and over again, it's something that I just want to put on and have a good laugh. It's probably Alicia Silverstone's best movie.
No, I think that's far and away Alicia Silverstone's best movie. And, no disrespect to Alicia Silverstone, but it's not like the bar is super high in that regard. But, and let me just say, so you feel comfortable, there's no judging here. I think that Clueless is actually a really enjoyable movie. I've seen it several times, and it's a movie that always kind of makes me laugh, and it's sort of self-consciously light, so it doesn't really weigh you down with a bunch of really depressing stuff or like confusing questions about what human nature is all about.
Well, I think it also has the distinction of being the best adaptation of Jane Austen's Emma, which is something that I feel like everybody should know, but I also think that not enough people realize that it's an adaptation of Emma. And I know that because when we had our Austen and Autumn event, we showed Clueless as one of our films, and a lot of people had no idea why we were doing it. And I think Heckerling does a really good job capturing the essence of Emma Woodhouse, who is the main character of Emma, who was, as described by Austen herself, a character only she could like. She's a meddler. She is a pretty haughty character. She looks down on those she deems lower class. And it's a long book. It's really probably worst, second only to Mansfield Park in terms of Jane Austen novels. And Amy Heckerling manages to take the best parts of it and put it in this 90s Beverly Hills setting. And the other thing is that as the writer, she invented all of this slang that we consider like as if and that kind of thing that we consider quintessential 90s slang was invented by Amy Heckerling for this movie. And it's got a great cast. You've got the late Brittany Murphy, you've got Stacey Dash, you've got Paul Rudd, and it's just really a great period 90s at its finest. I think the Cranberries get mentioned.
Right.
The part where she's driving and she like knocks all of the rear view mirrors off of the car and she's like,
Oh, should I write them a note?
It kills me, so.
Right. I mean, I will say that, and much to my embarrassment, that I didn't realize the Emma connection until we did it in the Austen and Autumn. I had seen it before more than once, but I do think it's a really compelling movie for all of the reasons that you suggest. I mean, it really takes you back to a certain moment in American culture, and it's really interesting, exactly as you say, that Amy Heckerling's script had this sort of reverse effect, like it sort of created the culture that it was trying to mirror too, in a way that I think is really, really interesting. And it's Alicia Silverstone is just absolutely perfectly cast. I mean, she has that sort of like kind of bubbly quality, and it seemed like in a lot of things that she did after that, she tried to kind of re-find a place where that character. Alicia Silverstone is one of those people who really only has one character. She's kind of like Lauren Graham from the Gilmore Girls is another perfect example. Lauren Graham isn't acting. If you see Lauren Graham on interview shows, really the character that she plays is the character that she is. And that's fine. I mean, really, there's a lot of actors in this world who can't even manage that, whereas she does it absolutely perfectly. I mean, we'll talk probably on some episode in the future, or maybe more than one, about the perfection of the Gilmore Girls or the sort of interesting things about it. But Alicia Silverstone also really has about one thing that she does really well, And she does it to an absolute perfection in Clueless in a way that really makes the movie, I think.
And it's a movie that celebrates female friendships, and that's sort of a running theme with movies that I like and movies that are my favorite. Movies that take the female perspective and are respectful of it and are interested in exploring that point of view or that agency, and you get that in just droves in Clueless. So I definitely recommend it. So now we've talked about movies we would declare to be our favorites to another person. We've talked about movies that we've seen the most, that we love, but we might not shout it from the rooftops. But I think there's another type of favorite movie, and those are ones that are movies that are good but are elevated by a great performance. So for me, when I think of that, I think of two fairly recent movies, Short Term 12 and Winter's Bone, which I think they're okay movies, they're good, but I think what makes them great and makes them movies that I might consider my favorite are because of the lead performances. You've got Brie Larson in Short Term 12 and Jennifer Lawrence in Winter's Bone.
Yeah, Winter's Bone was the only movie that turned up on both our lists. In a way, I think we both relate to it, partly because... So I saw this movie in Spokane. I'm from Eastern Washington, and I had no idea what it was going into the theater. But one of the things that I found compelling about it sort of generally was that you don't have to go very far outside of Spokane to get to a place where... Winter's Bone is about a young woman in sort of southern Appalachia who is trying to figure out what happened to her father. Her father has disappeared. It's pretty clear he's been killed, and she's trying to find out what happened to him. And a lot of it is sort of her going through this landscape of meth labs and illegal farming and people on drugs and brutal people and environment. Right, intense poverty. And, not to talk too bad about Eastern Washington, but there are places like that. The lifestyle that a lot of these people were living was not that far removed from things I saw growing up. And like, I know you're from a part of Pennsylvania where that's probably, once again, not to badmouth Pennsylvania, but it's far away from the big cities, and you see a lot of that kind of rural poverty, which is really grinding. But the thing that really elevates this movie is Jennifer Lawrence. It's one of her earlier... I think it's her first starring film role, and wow. Right. It is a performance, because without Jennifer Lawrence as the center of that movie, it's just sort of a story of nothing. There's not a ton that happens. There's not a huge plot. It's basically she needs to know what happened to her dad because he skipped bail, and if they don't find him or find proof that he's been murdered, they're going to lose the house, and the house is the only thing that's keeping her and her family above water. And it's basically just Jennifer Lawrence walking through the forest. But wow. Yeah, it's an incredible performance, and it really is one of those moments where someone creates a character that is just perfectly believable and fits perfectly in their environment. So she just keeps going to a sort of progressively more horrifying series of dumpy houses and messed up people, and she gets a serious beating at one point. And she does an incredible job, I think, of making a movie that just could be unbearably grim into something which is really uplifting in a weird way. It's incredible. You get to the end of the movie and you feel a weird sense of I don't want to call it hope, but you kind of feel like she'll be able to find her way through because she has this intense toughness and this sort of drive to get through her problems. And you think to yourself, well, she's in a bad situation, but you think that maybe she'll be able to find a way through it because she has this sort of strength of character. After seeing that movie, I knew Jennifer Lawrence was going to become a huge star, and I knew it wouldn't take much time, and I think within 6 months she had been cast in the Hunger Games, and that was it. Yeah, I had the same impression. She's just a fabulous talent. I could sort of wish that she'd done maybe some better movies.
I completely agree with you. Every time she shows up in one of these David O. Russell movies, which are good, she won an Academy Award for being in Silver Linings Playbook, but it's just not the performance she put up for Winter's Bone.
Yeah, the interesting thing about Silver Linings Playbook, just while we're on the topic, is that, here she's in a movie with Bradley Cooper, who's in a way the sort of male equivalent. Like, Bradley Cooper kind of came to prominence by playing the sort of flunky boyfriend to Jennifer Garner in Alias. And then he was in The Hangover. And then that movie was so big that he could just write his own ticket. And he wrote his own ticket into a bunch of movies that were really pretty lame, mostly. Except Silver Linings Playbook, which is, I thought, a really pretty good movie. But it's not, given who's in it, it could have been a fantastic movie. I mean, really, I really think that it's fair to say that Jennifer Lawrence and Bradley Cooper are two of the sort of real hot rising stars at the time this movie was made. And the movie it's just okay, which is fine. It's an enjoyable movie to watch, and Jennifer Lawrence did win an Academy Award for it. But Jennifer Lawrence, the story of Jennifer Lawrence in a lot of ways is the story of someone who's successful in material terms, but who artistically you feel like could be a lot more successful. Just, if you watch Winter's Bone, that is real acting. I mean, it's intense. It must have been really emotionally intense to do, because it's, she's in this very vulnerable situation, and she has to go into these situations where she's pretty much the only one who's not armed, or she's the only one there who's not ready to do, like, catastrophic violence at the drop of a hat in order to get what they want. And, this is a very intense sort of thing, which she pulls off perfectly. And you would want someone with those kind of acting chops to go on and do even more compelling things. And instead she's gone on and done a lot of movies that didn't really seem to make use of the qualities she has as an actress. I mean, she went through and made all those Hunger Games movies, which are entertaining, but they're not there's not a great deal of depth in those movies.
My love of Jennifer Lawrence has quickly been transferred to Brie Larson now, who I think has a better head on her shoulders. I don't know Jennifer Lawrence personally, so I'm only speculating. But now my go-to favorite actress has got to be Brie Larson, and from seeing her in Short Term 12 and always forgetting she's in Scott Pilgrim, which is another movie I like a lot, and she's shown up here a few times on our list with starring in Room and winning an Academy Award for that. So I'm very much... I saw Kong, Skull Island, because she was in it.
Right. I'm afraid that even her qualities, which are quite considerable, could not rescue that movie. But when I saw Room, I thought to myself, she should win the Academy Award for the first hour of this movie. Room is a movie that turned up on my list, and it's one of those movies. I mean, this is another sort of take on favorite movies. I really thought this was one of the best movies I've ever seen. I never ever want to see it again. I think everyone should watch it one time. It's not going to be the kind of movie you're going to want to,
pop in on a Saturday afternoon and let me watch Room.
Right, yeah, get to, get a bag of chips and a Coke or something like that. And no, I mean, it's incredibly intense and it's uplifting. The story of Room is this woman who's been held prisoner for all these years, and her child who finally finds a way to break free and kind of recover herself, but also get over the sort of feeling of guilt that she has for having fallen into this situation. I mean, let's say she didn't fall into it, someone did it to her. But this is why it's a really interesting movie. It's all about her kind of reconstructing herself, and it's really an intense and beautiful movie that I really would not ever want to see a second time.
So be on the lookout for Brie Larson. She's going to be in the adaptation of The Glass Castle.
Oh, yeah, I think I read something about that.
Coming up. And, of course, she's going to be joining the MCU as Carol Danvers, a.k.a. Captain Marvel, a movie which I had zero interest in until I found out Brie Larson was going to be in it.
Right. I think that really moved that movie right onto the list of things I actually do want to see.
I'm not the biggest fan of the Captain Marvel comics. I prefer Carol Danvers as Ms. Marvel, but I am curious to see what what Marvel is planning on doing with the character. But inevitably, that will be a discussion for a later date.
Well, that's all we really have time for. I think we've pretty much doubled the length of our last podcast. Do we have any thoughts about what we're going to do for our next one?
I think we're going to be talking The Walking Dead. I believe the finale of The Walking Dead is happening soon, so we may actually bring a staff member or two who are more familiar with the show than we are to talk to us about it.
That sounds like it should be fun.
No Talking in the Library is a production of Mentor Public Library. Opinions expressed are those of the presenters and don't necessarily reflect those of the library management or the library board. You can find us on the web at www.mentorpl.org/adults/no talking. No Talking in the Library is edited by Marilyn Weiss. Our website is maintained by Mary Pelton. And our theme music is by Adriana Crickle. And also, for the record, the name of the submarine in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is the Nautilus.